So there's a need within the tailings management framework not to replace or change any of the existing regulatory requirements. Even though experience has shown there are some areas, you can look at any piece of regulation, there's always a need to refine and continuously improve. But it's really about making sure that whatever we're doing on tailings is clearly guided by government policy and direction, and then the rules can follow, whether they're current rules, new rules, etc. So when we look at Directive 74, we learned a lot from it. It was a necessary shift in the mindset of managing tailings, and it was motivated by very specific reasons, but it wasn't because there was no action going on. It was need to elevate and accelerate certain action. And we did see, and even today, we saw continue to see significant investment in dealing with this issue. But by not having, in some instances, appropriate guidance from government from a policy perspective, some of the innovative flexibility that was behind the directive may not have always been able to be incorporated, considered, or without clear government direction, not knowing which way or what path any particular technology should be going, or in terms of when things weren't performing or not meeting the needs and expectations, how that fits in terms of is that going to hit the mark for government outcomes. And so what we saw was, certainly within the tailings management framework, or with Directive 74, was a focus on flow and looking at how to manage current tailings that are being created, not necessarily legacy tailings, even though the learnings and technologies and processes are readily, I think, transferable in many areas. But by looking at a new management framework for tailings, we're not only talking about helping to provide further guidance to the regulator in existing requirements or new requirements, but to reset, I guess, the outcome or the focus on outcomes to what are we really expecting to see from companies ultimately in terms of how we expect to see tailings managed. And even though, again, it's implicit within the current regulatory systems, it's not explicitly stated that we're really talking about a holistic management of mine from beginning to end and thinking about all the configurations. It's not just you're going to create waste at the front end and it's got to be gone at the back end. It's understanding how you're avoiding that at the front end or minimizing it at the front end and dealing with it during operation, ultimately managing it at the back end. There's a need through appropriate principles and direction to make sure that there is an emphasis and a desire to ensure that industry is motivated and encouraged to find the appropriate innovations. Sometimes encouraged is through management frameworks and a bit of a stick, but it's still with flexibility in mind. And being transparent and being okay about when things are working or not working, the ability to learn from, use the information to help inform and guide what is working. And so I think what we've seen is by not having an appropriate framework, we haven't been able to talk about perhaps the right elements of what we've been seeing with respect to tailings management over the last few years, about what is working, what's not working, because there's a bit of a sensitivity to some extent on making sure that regulatory requirements are adhered to. And obviously no company is going to say they're not going to meet a certain requirement, and the amount of effort and the investment that's gone is quite significant. But what's clear is we don't have all the answers at this point, and so we need a forum and a space to be able to find and discover some of those answers, create certain criteria, whether it's reclamation criteria, or prove out or disprove certain technologies. And central to that is really looking at the volume, and I'll talk about why volume is important next. It's about risk. So even though there isn't how much fluid tailings is too much from a landscape or economic perspective, you don't have that number. But we know that it is a risk that needs to be managed by somebody over the long term. And so Minister Fawcett in Hansard recently was asked about the tailings management framework, and he talked about ensuring that whatever is on the landscape doesn't have a significant environmental and financial risk to taxpayers. And that really has been the driver of the discussions around tailings management framework. We can't really figure out that optimal number or volume, but from a government perspective, how much is too much from the perspective of an economic liability to citizens, to the Crown, recognizing that legally that liability is held by companies, but what if the company couldn't deliver? What if government was left having to manage that? And that has changed a bit of it, or allowed a different type of conversation about, well, how much would be too much? And obviously, it's still, there's various factors that feed into that conversation, but that was really a major guiding post, taking the outcomes, focusing on volume and managing that liability, to translating into certain principles that you'll see in the tailings management framework when it moves through the government decision-making process in the next couple of months. But it talks about the economic, environmental, social aspects. So it's not just about the environment, even though that's core. It's about some of those other pieces. It's introducing certain thresholds so that we have those lines that are tied to some extent to that liability of how much is too much from a liability a financial liability perspective. But it helps to create a path, or the ladder, if you will, to the application of escalating management responses. It's not in a traditional model, you're in compliance, you're out of compliance. It's more, you have time to manage a certain compliance line. If you're beginning to deviate from that, there's a management response that either requires the operator or group of operators to deal with it. There may be some financial securities or other things that may be captured when you're not on track or deviating. And if you're still not performing to how you should be relative to to other operators, or relative to what would be reasonably expected, well, then you have the ability to look at more tougher mitigation responses, such as production curtailment or enforcement orders, or things, again, really in instances where people that are just should be doing better just aren't. So that ladder allows a reality check of, there may be good reasons why somebody can't meet their expectations. Technology may not be performing, so it's what are you doing about it that's more important than, so what line are you on, are you under, or above or below? And a lot of this, in terms of the thresholds, in terms of that liability that we are trying to manage, really in the discussions on the tailings management framework, is still with that end in mind, but it's not that nebulous, we're going to have sustainable ecosystems, functioning ecosystems, but it's about how much fluid volume, how much volume of fluid tailings do we want to have on the landscape, untreated or treated to some extent, but they're waiting for that final hole to be dug, or waiting for some final piece in the mine plan to be addressed. What is that volume that we're comfortable with saying, if the industry disappeared, could we realistically manage that because we've collected appropriate securities, etc.? And it's not an infinite number. Even though we can collect as much money as we want, it is a set number. And so within the framework itself, we've taken a run at and worked with industry and other stakeholders to find that end of mine number that is an appropriate level, not only for what's actually on the landscape at that end of mine, but what can reasonably be handled over an appropriate time frame post end of mine life. So talking around the details of a framework, and hopefully, though, people can get a bit of an understanding of the elements of a framework or an approach to tailings. It's very similar to the frameworks that do exist today for air and water in the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, but it's taking things where science, even though not perfect, helps to inform and guide some of the thresholds, and figure out how in the tailings paradigm, how we apply very similar management approaches. And so again, just emphasizing that risk, that financial management risk, and that's the direction that was taken. Again, can't stress enough that when we think about innovation and collaboration, we're seeing a lot more recently on tailings through groups like COSIA, a lot more of what's needed, and we want to continue to see that motivation. But some of the, I think, earlier experience, and I think it's driven by that traditional regulatory model, really has been in-house expertise. And even just this morning, it was interesting sitting at a table with people that used to work for a particular company. Now they're teaching about this sort of stuff. It just reaffirms that a lot of the knowledge, or assumptions, a lot of the knowledge and experience that's out there is being driven within the company, and that's really where the emphasis has been. So how do we bring that knowledge out through forums like this, and encouraging and pushing industry, whether it's the operators themselves or third-party technology providers, to be able to be sharing information and knowledge. It still provides a competitive advantage and opportunity, because we need that motivation, that business motivation, but allows things to move forward and things to progress, and a lack of barriers related to, well, that just doesn't fit with our corporate culture, or government is not pushing us or encouraging us to try different things because we might fail, so we're going to stick with what we know. So what we need to see in this system is that failure is an option, and it has to be an option, certainly when it comes to tailings, not because, well, we didn't figure it out, so we're just going to walk away. But a lot of the experiences that still have to be, I think, received on tailings is what technologies are going to work for what types of configuration. And we know that each project is going to be unique, each circumstance is going to be unique. In this room more than anybody. So we need to create a place where companies are motivated to take risk, but they have backstops, they have alternatives, there's contingency plans, so it's not eggs all in one basket, and there's no shortage, I think, of opportunities in that regard for tailings. And if we think about flipping through the technology roadmap that Alberta Innovates supported, with, again, input probably from most, if not all of you in this room, where there's hundreds of technologies out there. Obviously, with anything, some of them probably are never going to see the light of day. They're great on the back of a napkin, but there are no shortage of opportunities and configurations. It's just, how do we create that space that encourages actually test driving some of these technologies, and not just at a local or micro scale, but actually at a commercial scale. And so we are thinking, even within the framework, how do we motivate companies where things aren't working to not necessarily say, well, let's just take some more time, but to say, well, maybe you need to make certain investments in other technologies and try those out. Maybe you need to explore other technologies with other companies. And so rather than just, well, we'll see if it happens, incorporating that into the actual management system. So that when we're thinking about technologies, it's not just in the context of the traditional model, making sure that whatever we build is solid, and that's important, and certainly don't want to dismiss that. But when we think about where we're trying to go, it is about, at the front end, how do we, if you call tailings a waste, how do we prevent it from the get-go so that there isn't anything at the back end? What is created, how do we minimize it through the appropriate configuration of our mine plans, knowing that the people at the back end, at the final reclamation, may not be talking to the people at the front end in terms of who's digging that first hole. So how do you get those conversations happening? And then ultimately, how do you have those waste control technologies at the back end? So there's pieces that have been explored, but have they always been put together? Not sure. But I think as a government, our expectation is that that's the type of conversation that's going on with respect to tailings. And if it is, that's great, but I think we need to see more of that. And it's no different than household waste. Before it was created waste, threw it out, somebody took it to a landfill. Now, as my 11-year-old continues to remind me, first reduce the waste coming in terms of what you buy. And then what's in the house? Well, we can reuse that wrapping paper or whatever. And then finally, what's out there? Is that organic or is that recycling? Even though this costs a lot more in that paradigm, that's a different shift that's taken a number of years, and I think we need to see some of that on tailings. So looking forward on the policy side, we know, again, that we could be very successful in tailings, and the miracle technology could be talked about today and implemented in tailings could disappear tomorrow, but we know that there's other impacts that oil sands has on the landscape. So this is one part of the responsible development story, and there's others that we need to be aware of. There are still, I think, some significant learnings to be had, but not just in the context of more talk. We need drivers and motivation to translate some of the ideas and some of the technologies into play. We need to make sure that those that have these good ideas are able to have open discussions with, whether it's groups like COSIA or specific companies, that there aren't barriers to trying to test this, or at least barriers from the perspective of, if we fail, we're out of compliance. We need to take that off the table. Again, not to say that have fun with it and go for it. It's got to be planned risk, and learnings have to inform contingencies. Thinking about tailings shouldn't just be about the end of the mine, so we'll get to it, we'll have a good technology waiting, or we'll start processing something and then we'll get to, we'll really ramp up at the back end. It's really got to be about, well, how does that first shovel when it hits the ground, thinking about the waste and the waste management cycle. Government needs to, the tailings management framework is the mechanism, and we're looking to do that to set the policy framework, set some clear guidance to support what outcomes are expected, what are the backstops and the approach, so that the regulator has a system to work within to provide the assurances necessary for effective tailings management. Talked about thinking about tailings. There's an environmental component, no doubt, but really in a liability perspective of the stuff that may be left on the landscape has a cost, has a risk that needs to be managed. So how do we use financial provisions that within a sector we know and we understand and we use for a variety of ways? How do we use that to help support and encourage action on tailings? And I mentioned prudent risk, so it's not just let's try everything under the sun, but an informed approach to exploring technologies and different processes. And at the end of the day, though, recognizing that this is a multi-billion-dollar challenge. From an operational perspective, what we talked about in the advancement of a tailings management framework is making sure that policy intent and that guidance from a policy framework is really looking at optimizing the mine planning, minimizing and dealing with the tailings that are created. So thinking about the entire process, trying to mobilize and get more third-party expertise into support. There's no single person or single body of knowledge on tailings. It's all very unique knowledge and experience. So we need to ensure that there's, for public assurance and ultimately I think for regulatory and government assurance, that there's additional frameworks, accounting frameworks, management frameworks that can provide that extra level of confidence of exploring and testing new technologies. We know that technologies will have to be tested at various scales. There may be some management responses if things aren't working, that government signals in terms of expectations around, again, companies perhaps being expected to, if certain processes or investments aren't being realized, maybe there's a fund or another mechanism that guides investment in other commercial or testing at a commercial scale other technologies, but doing it in a way that works with companies. So that fine line of setting expectation but not getting into the business of business. We also know we want to see continued opportunities for water recycling and water matching, not only within the mineable oil sands sector, but looking at some of the interests at a broader regional scale with respect to in situ and municipal interests. So making sure that we're thinking about, again, this holistic approach to mine management. And then ultimately, the water's got to go somewhere. And so from an operational perspective, again, setting the policy signals and the direction that we need to begin to develop the criteria for ultimate end fate of water, whether it's release or resting place and things like end pit lakes. And if all done right, we know that there's still some learnings to be had, a role for companies to be able to demonstrate progress towards regulatory and policy outcomes, but also at the same time a recognition that the actual answers and the solutions aren't off the shelf either from an economic reason or from a scope and scale reason. So we have to figure out how can we create regulatory rules that accommodate that. And that recognizing the focus on oil sands, that again, whether it's a failure in a technology performance or the pace of management of tailings, if it's not going as expected, how do we demonstrate that as responsible management if there's, again, good reasons or good learnings that come for that. So broadly, the three themes of thinking about responsible development and tailings in the broader picture of other environmental management requirements. recognizing the role of business and supporting and encouraging innovation through those mechanisms, and ultimately collaboration and what mechanisms are necessary. So our intent is that through the Tailings Management Framework, we've considered and tried to enable those systems most effectively, not only from a government perspective, but now when it's approved to the regulator to be able to translate into regulatory requirements. So that is it, and I look forward to, I think, a few questions and comments if we have time.